We've done the Red Line Warden, so now it's time to move on to the new Blue Line Warden in the Lord of the Rings Online. I will be going through my building process of the spec with the Update 35 Revamp. This one focusing on general tanking and just defenses, basically what you want to do as a tank. There is still, like the old Red Line build that we just did, a ton of flexibility, especially in the yellow line, so I will be covering that as well. Anyway, to take a look at the current build I have, just like with the Red Line video, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just following this particular one. Again, I've been testing things out and partially been lazy to change stuff, which we are going to do today. But compared to the Red Line build, it will probably look at least very similar. Anyway, we'll go ahead and respec here, and just speccing into Blue Line, we actually get a couple things. First off, we just get a 1 minute 3-second cooldown ability that could potentially be impacted by some of my tracers. I suspect so with the very odd 63-second duration, so just keep that in mind if your numbers are slightly different, but that's good to restore some morale and boost our defenses. And then we also get a single target force taunt on a 10-second cooldown, and it is ranged with warning shot. On top of that, you get some increased healing, increased mitigations, increased morale, and decreased power cost. Wow, it's hard to go wrong speccing into Blue Line. At least you don't get your damage nerfed, kind of unlike Red Line with your healing nerf. Anyway, to start off with the trait tree here, you can get increased fist gambit damage, or you can get increased healing. As a tank spec, our priority is going to be on things like self-healing, defenses, and things that are beneficial for tanking. So we'll start off with the healing, and we can look at some damage stuff later, because I will point out one of the benefits of the Warden tank, besides actually being viable in terms of defense and regular tank stuff now, is that you can be a very high DPS tank. The main problem with that is that situations where you do want to be in tank spec, you don't necessarily want high damage, but you do have that option if your defenses are high enough for whatever you're running and you still want a proper tank spec. Anyway, moving on from that little rant, we'll go ahead and get Defiant Challenge, because that is our AoE force taunt, and you can actually get a pretty nice reflect buff on that as well. Moving on to Careful Shield Work, this one increases our reduced incoming damage for range and tacticals from shield up. Also will point out, if you have not seen, I have a video on all the new Warden gambits and effects if you're less familiar with those. And because of great design here, we just have to spend a single point in Warcry here to advance to the next row. So hey, we'll do that. Anyway, kind of like with Careful Shield Work here, we have Careful Readied Work to increase our melee damage reduction from ready blades, so we'll go ahead and pick that. Now, critical defense can be a little bit of an interesting one. Some people don't recommend it, some people do recommend it. It's mainly useful for big critical hits that could potentially one-shot you, and just reducing the effects of those. So we'll go ahead and put some points on that to unlock the next row. And why I am not putting points right now in Redirected Ire, that is because Redirect Ire is only useful if you need extra threat. If you have no threat issues, then this doesn't really have that much of an effect. That said, one point in this could be useful to have your deflection gambit increase your threat rather than reduce it. It does have some odd uses even as a tank spec to have it reduce your threat. If you're trying to swap aggro to another tank, you really shouldn't have issues with that, but I thought I'd point out that kind of niche use. That said, I do actually like putting 1 point in that just to get the effect where deflection gambit now increases threat rather than reduces it. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next row with that. Shield gambit buff duration, that's very huge quality of life, especially with the numerous amounts of buff you have, so we'll go ahead and put points into that. And Resounding Challenge, just like the previous trait here with Redirect Ire, this is basically only useful if you are running into threat issues. Every time that I have tanked in the new content with the Warden update, I have never had threat issues, even in AoE, single target, whatever have you. So I have not found any use for this, and of course having damage instead of having Resounding Challenge build threat instead of damage, I would rather the damage if possible. That said, sometimes the damage can get in the way. I hate to admit that, but there are situations where you're in AoE and perhaps crowd control mobs could get hit by Resounding Challenge, and having it do threat instead of damage over time could be useful for that. Just thought I'd point that out, especially for a tank build. And of course, if you need the threat, go ahead and put the point on this. Moving on to Stand Your Ground, this is honestly not really exciting in that it gives you increased block and parry rating at the cost of evade rating, but does eventually give you increased block and parry chance. Honestly, it's not the most impactful, and it's kind of the opposite of critical protection in that it's mostly useful against little attacks that you are actually able to BPE. So all that said, it is something that impacts our defenses, but I would at this point rather wait and see, because honestly, when we're in AoE, and again with a lot of little attacks, typically you have things like your AoE morale taps that can generally be more impactful, so I find myself needing crit defense more than that, but just 3 points in that will unlock the next row, and we have a basically completely useless trait here with practice fundamentals, and the reason it's useless is it only improves our 2 builder length gambits, and the ones that give us a buff are, well, we have this guy right here, Impressive Flourish, and hopefully I'm not forgetting any, but the other one here is ranged, well, melee, whatever stance you are in, Persevere here, which gives us a heal and a small incoming healing buff, and this just increases damage over time, healing by a very minor amount up to 10% and plus 15-second buff duration. It's just not worth 4 trait points at this point. Moving on though, we do have some useful stuff with just increased shield gambit line healing, so I'll go ahead and put points in that, and kind of similar healing over time pulses, so we'll put points in that. And here's where we get to some more interesting things with decreased never surrender cooldown, so that's our long defensive cooldown, 5-minute cooldown, and then that will be reduced by 3 minutes to just 2 minutes, so definitely worth putting points in. Morale tap damage and healing, still do find that to be useful, especially of course in AoE situations. That's where our morale taps really shine. So yeah, we'll go ahead and put points in that, and at this point I'll go ahead and backfill, because this isn't necessarily a particular order type build guide. I'll go ahead and backfill Stand Your Ground and Critical Protection because those are ultimately useful. And we'll grab for the free peoples here, which is actually one of our advanced technique skills. We get a ton of these as a Blue Line Warden. Again, I recommend checking out my previous video for all the more specific effects with this, but this will reduce our incoming damage, and the impact of that is based on how many advanced techniques you consume. And then we also get a decreased incoming damage buff when you consume a full stack of advanced techniques, and this will actually apply to the fellowship, so that's definitely worth getting. And at this point we pretty much have the blue line filled out for where we want it, and this is where we can move into the red line for some boosted damage, or the yellow line for some boosted damage, in particular range damage, as well as some other things, and a lot of utility and support based stuff, and even some defensive stuff, which is all ultimately helpful for a Blue Line Warden. All that said, we should check out the set bonuses real quick, and Thrill of Battle is pretty simple, and then it increases morale tap damage and healing. And then for our Shield Mastery and Shield Tactics gambits, those get a little bit of a physical mitigation and tactical mitigation buff that helps make them worth maintaining. And then for Close Call, when you evade or give a partial evade, you will restore a little bit of morale. It's 1% of your max morale. It's not that much. It can only trigger every 3 seconds, which is not that frequently. And then Shield Tactics has a ton of effects here, but this basically improves the buffs from a lot of your shield gambits. And you already have all these effects on these gambits, but it just increases the magnitude of them, so I won't focus on that too much. And then some more things that impact advanced techniques here. So when you consume advanced techniques or complete gambit chains, then you will get a short defensive buff here. For getting to tier 3 advanced techniques, you can get minus 4% incoming damage, but for consuming tier 3, you can get minus 12% incoming damage, which actually adds up to quite a bit. But moving on to the second to last set bonus here, this just gives us more pulses to our area of effect morale taps, which is good quality of life, makes those last longer. And finally, Desperate Combat, a little bit of a complicated advanced technique ability, but this will be a new cooldown that we get, minute 30-second cooldown. And it has a lot of effects, including even increasing the incoming damage of enemies to giving you an AoE self-heal and AoE force taunt and even an AoE stun. In fact, the tooltips for this one trait is 3 wide, so just to show what Desperate Shield actually looks like for an example. And back to being zoomed in so you all can see the font. Again, there are some things in the red line that you could consider for just straight DPS boost, but we'll be focusing more on the tank oriented stuff for the purposes of this building video. And I will say I went a lot more in depth into the trait choices in the red line video if you are interested in that, but basically we aren't really interested in range damage or light type damage. Now the ratings buff from shield gambits, this is a kind of interesting one, even though I will say right now it's probably not the most useful, because the main buff that you are interested in from your gambits is not the rating buffs here. Increasing that by 10% could get the tactical mitigation, sure, near to 100k with my numbers, get the evade rating buff up even more, but the main benefit of these gambits after I actually apply my traits here is going to be the percent, like 3% tactical mitigation here, for example. And that applies to basically all of our Gambit buffs, so this is something I'd rather wait and maybe see if we have enough leftover trait points for it. And even then, it's not the most significant boost, so we will avoid that just for now. Still, I'll go ahead and put 5 points in mark target duration because this does give our Gambits in the boot through cauterizing steel Gambit sequence the mark target debuff, which debuffs enemy physical mitigation by 7%, and this will allow it to last 1 minute. So I'll put all 5 points then, and pretty similar, we'll go ahead and just do that with diminished target. That's the same type of effect here, but it's going to be for the precise blow through Spear of Fate Gambit sequence, and this one decreases the tactical mitigation of the enemies. Moving on though, here in the second row, with decreased attack duration and assailment stance, that's probably not going to be the most useful for us, but getting up to 5% crit chance is actually very useful. You might wonder why, because we aren't too interested in damage, and hey, crit chance really improves our damage, but it also improves our self-healing with self-critical heals. On top of that, won't turn down the extra damage from it. And we're not getting 6 points on this because that just impacts ranged critical damage, just as an extra recap. But moving on for finesse, this one could be a little bit more interesting for blue line wardens because I find I naturally have less finesse when I'm in tank oriented gear. So it is entirely possible that this would be more useful for you if you are a tank warden than it would be for a red line warden, depending, again, just depends on your gear and your traits. So when I am playing my blue line warden, I do find finesse to be useful, and of course you want finesse so enemies don't BPE you or resist you, which can be, it's already bad for a DPS character, but can be extra bad as they could potentially miss your important tanking effects, especially with things like force taunts. So again, how many points you put into that ultimately depends on how much finesse you need and to get you to a point where you're no longer physically avoided or resisted. For my character, I need about 3 points of finesse here, so I went ahead and put 3 points in, but again, that can vary, and we might even potentially put a little bit more in just to be extra safe, depending if we have any leftover trait points. All of that said, we can increase Javelin skill's maximum range, which is mainly a quality of life thing, but I will point out a bit more importantly for blue line compared to red line is that it would increase the range of your force taunt ability, which could be kind of convenient, but that's 5 trait points for that effect. Moving on for battering strikes, this does add the critical defense debuff to enemies up to 5 ranks that has a somewhat useful debuff. If you do have another warden in the group, notably you can actually have your battering strikes debuff stack. A lot of the other warden effects do not actually stack, but importantly to note, this one actually does with up to 1 more other warden. So all that said, in tanking situations, you're typically going to be in a group, and that's where this effect would shine compared to if you're like in a solo situation. But if you are playing blue line as more of a safe solo spec, then this wouldn't really have much use. But for my character, I'm going to go ahead and put this in here because I primarily play blue line when I am tanking in a group. Strong foundations, just like with red line, very immediately put 2 points in that because reducing the Gambit builder mastery cooldown by even 2 seconds is a huge effect because you can use those more frequently to build your powerful Gambits a lot more rapidly. Now for Enduring Assailment, this one's a little bit more interesting for blue line because increasing the duration of these debuffs, notably Suppression, which we don't have yet, but we're going to pick, and Battering Strikes is decent quality of life. It's 5 trait points for 20 seconds increased effect on those. That said, it's something that I'll go ahead and save for later and see what sort of trait points we have left after things that we actually definitely know we want. So Suppression, I already hinted at we want that, and that just decreases the outgoing damage of enemies, notably good for our own survival, and it does that when you use a Gambit in the Warcry through Desolation, so AoE damage over time, Gambit sequence. Now just like with Redline, Piercing Javelins basically completely useless. If you're having issues with your Javelin abilities being physically avoided or resisted, then you should just get Finesse. Now for a Javelin of Deadly Force, if you remember Marked and Diminished Target here, these 2 traits that give the physical and tactical mitigation debuffs to your single target Gambit sequences here, this ability actually applies those debuffs to a large range of targets. So that is definitely worth putting a point in, and just to point out, when you have 5 points in both Diminished and Marked Target, then this has a 1 minute duration and a 1 minute cooldown, so you can have good uptime just using Javelin of Deadly Force and AoE. That said, it can still be useful to get something like Snapshot here, which actually makes your Gambit builders have a chance to reset your Javelin cooldowns. And the reason is it can help increase consistency, and especially in AoE, or if you just happen to miss a target, it can help with that, and it does reset Javelin of Deadly Force. Also, notably, as we'll get to in a moment, it does reset the cooldown of Ambush, which could be helpful more so with a Blue Line Warden than a Red Line Warden. So I'll go ahead and put a point in that, but looking at Adroit Ambush here, this will make Adroit Maneuver remove the induction of your next ambush. So when you use Adroit Maneuver, this will make ambush usable as an instant stun in combat and notably increase your run speed. So one thing is that Warden tanks don't quite have as much compared to some other tanks is a very easy access sprint, which can be useful, of course, for running away either from effects or just enemies if you need to kite momentarily. And this helps with that because you can not only knock out your enemy, assuming they are actually stunnable. Some bosses are not. Most bosses are not actually. It still gives you the run speed boost. So that's definitely more useful for a Blue Line Warden than it would have been for a Red Line Warden. And at this point, if you are a Blue Line Warden, I would still recommend going ahead and just putting a couple trait points here into Fire at Will, because this gives you a fellowship-wide buff to increase the ranged and tactical damage of your fellowship members. Not the most impactful to you as a tank warden, but does give decreased attack duration as well as a fairly low uptime, around 1/6 or about 15% uptime if you use it on cooldown, but it does have that little bit of an effect. And finally here we have Rapid Techniques, with just like the Red Line Warden. Again, this is very valuable in that it's a 1:30 cooldown ability, but for 6 seconds it allows you to use your mastery, Gambit Mastery builders without any cooldown, which allows you to just build gambits very rapidly, either in time of need when you are like just needing a bunch of self-heals rapidly, or to build your defenses up real quick, or just what have you. With tanking, it adds a ton of, say, maneuverability to the way you use your gambits if you really need to build something rapidly. And there we go. At 89 trait points, this is what I consider roughly a baseline Blue Line Warden build with 3 extra trait points in Finesse here. And at this point, you really just have flexibility. Again, I've highlighted a whole bunch of different things with like increased threat or turning Resounding Challenge here to a threat builder instead of a damage over time gambit. And you even have some options for increased damage in the yellow line here, like increased light type damage. With 9 trait points, you don't really have that much flexibility in moving into the red line, but perhaps something for you to consider if you want that. If you need even more finesse, you have that. If you want Enduring Assailment to have increased duration on those debuffs, you can get that. If you want to build for a ranged warden tank, perhaps you could get something like Endurance Training or Throwing Arm. Throwing Arm again has some extra utility with some of your ranged gambits that you actually would use, perhaps a little bit more frequently than a typical DPS group content warden, with in particular Warning Shot and Ambush. So depending what content you run, how you play your warden, and all that sort of stuff, you just have a lot of options here. Hopefully this video has given you some idea on where you can spend the trait points to your liking to just help better your warden. But for me, I'll go ahead and put some more points into, or just put points into Enduring Assailment here, which will leave me with 4 points available. And just to be extra safe, I'm going to put 1 more point in Finesse. Don't necessarily need that last one. And with the last 3 trait points, just because I'm really greedy with damage, I'll just go ahead and get increased light type damage up to 12% there. And that will be how I have my Blue Line Warden build so far. If I were building this for completely solo, there are of course different things I would do, as I covered, but at this point I'm pretty happy with this for just this building video. Again, I hope this was helpful to you all building the new Blue Line Warden, and I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching everyone.